Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog, and I am beginning a series on understanding class in a more suitable way for sociological distinctions. Now, I say that because I also think when you talk about class in broad terms and political terms, classes are constitutive of their role in production and how coherent they can act. So when we talk about sociological class, we're not talking about the same thing as when we're talking about Marxist class, and there are very varied sociological definitions of class. We've gone over this a lot. What we haven't gone over is the complicatedness of figuring out stuff like racial wealth gaps and their ties to social class, because the categories we use are necessarily limiting. All right, the big thing is the average versus the median. And one of the things you can tell about the absurdity of wealth inequality in America is that in white families, the average household wealth is over $900,000 a year, while the median is $171,000 a year. There's almost 8 times more in the average than the median, meaning that the high ends of wealth are so highly skewed that it makes the median and average very different. The average is an aggregate, the median is looking at percentiles and finding the middle range number. Now, even the median can be misleading. And when we talk about whiteness, we throw everyone who identifies as white together, regardless of when their family came over here, what their relationship is to historical capital or slavery, what the class designation of their families was prior. But there is something real about the race gap in wealth. The average black family has only $17,000 in wealth. Now, we define wealth in both categories here, even we're looking at the median, in assets minus debt. Now, we must also admit that one of the things that will throw these numbers off is in both categories, there's probably tons of people who are in negative wealth, meaning they have far more debt than assets. And this is very interesting to me. On a prior show, I believe it is the rational kernel of the PMC episode, I said that there is not that huge of a difference between white wealth and black wealth if you bracketed out the extremes. Now, I think I need to revise that. Friend of the show, Colin Drumm, said, well, pretending that $150,000 in median wealth is not significant is pretty huge. Although he also agreed with me that the biggest cause of this is just the appreciation of home values. Black people get hit doubly on this. Redlining limited housing stocks historically, and also limited mostly to renters. So there's been very little generational accumulation of wealth within the black middle class, in quotation marks, whatever that means. And there has been more generous policies that almost all whites benefited from in the 1950s and 60s, in the beginning of the baby boom and the post-war social compact. So there's that there. Now, the generational accumulation of wealth proper and massive holes of wealth beyond, say, just owning a house and its appreciation, it has to do with generational wealth over a long durée and implicates a different set of people. What we don't know is because neither Bierkings nor Pew, who looked at this demographic research, really bothers to break it down, and the census doesn't really ask this question, is which whites and which blacks are actually benefiting? Is there truth to the ADOS claim? How much is recent immigration shifting wealth up or down in any given category? we can easily see how black codes, redlining, and the New Year's Fair Labor Standards exemption of domestic agricultural and service occupations from the benefits of the New Deal did play a huge role in the median wealth difference. And it's also hard to say about where it is now. I suspect it's probably gotten slightly worse because housing appreciation was out of control after COVID until very recently. It's important to remember that inheritance accounts for roughly 4% of household income. So that explains some of it. And like I said, home ownership and passing down homes explains most of it. And in some ways, I think this is both major and also kind of easy to fix on a radical scale at the same time. It's major in that it's not just home ownership and the appreciation of homes, the credit you can get laid off that leads to many kinds of inequities on business loans and other kinds of things that you can get, insurance rates, ratings of cost in general, all tied in the race. When I worked for an insurance company, I used to actually really talk about this, that you could get graduates from Morehouse. I'm actually not even making this story up. This is verbatimly true, to overlook systemic racism in actuarial rates because of insurance costs in zip codes, not even looking at the racial demographics of those zip codes. The insurance cost was related to property damage, and property damage was related to deindustrialization. You can see how this goes. It didn't just hurt Black families, as Black families are only 14% of the population, but it did disproportionately hurt them. Also hurt Latin families. And redlining and that limiting of wealth is very real and still felt today. But if you look at the amount of even though there's a 10 times difference between the median of white and Black income, if you think about the average home price in the United States right now, the average home price in dollars currently, according to is 400,000. So the difference is actually kind of interesting. You would think it would actually be higher than it would be, given the difference in home ownership and the difference in home appreciation. What this tells us is we also need to look at debt. And what this gets me to is a complicated view on the accumulation of wealth within sectors of the middle class sociologically, and of, let's say, the better off working class, the top 50% of the working class, if we define working class by people who live off of wages and not capital holdings. So if we look at that, we have to ask a bunch of questions. One, why is the median and average so different? There's two. It is true that 75% of the income difference is between the median average, which means it's between the upper percent of income owners. We have to then ask, though, who are these people? Yes, they're related to the bourgeoisie and other kinds of high power professional functionaries who are able to accumulate wealth off time. But what were their advantages? Are their advantages coming because they got the best homeownership rates even before the wars? How much difference in wealth is there between people who've had generational homeownership going back before the GI Bills and the New Deal and those who get homeownership after, right? Which groups benefit the most? Is this still predominantly WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant descendants, or this is true for all white ethnics whatsoever? Right? If you want to do this kind of demographicness, you need to use a finer tooth comb than American racial categories tend to allow for us to actually draw significant conclusions about the reality of who benefited from racialist policies. We can assume that all white people benefited some, but we can't assume that they all benefited equally, and our rhetoric does not deal with that. Nor can we say it would be interesting to know where Black families did better and where they didn't. Before the 1980s, it was actually pretty clear Black families did better in the Northeast. The average Black worker on income did better than the average white worker in the South. But that's not true in this wealth inheritance, or it would show up in the numbers. So we have to ask ourselves, what has happened and why is that the case? Now, redlining and service exemptions from New Deal laws applied across the country. Jim Crow only applied in part of it, although there were Jim Crow-esque laws everywhere. But the Black codes are unique to the former Confederacy. So is this all throughout the United States, or is it just affecting the highest concentration of Black people, which is in the South, with also the highest concentration of descendants of slaves? We need to know this to understand the fine lineage of the way wealth developed in the class, because wealth is accumulated generationally. We must understand this, and while we can thank the Brookings Institute and Pew for looking at the census data and really breaking it down, we can't really draw simple conclusions because the categories are really broad. Take when we talk about other racial categories. Latin is clear, but everything else is an other. Now, that's a little bit interesting because some of the things, the other line is above Latin and Black on the income graph. I mean that literally. Let me pull that up for you. Right, we can see here that other is significantly above Black and Hispanic families and significantly below white. But who's in other? And why I find that interesting is that income for certain other groups, such as South Asians, Nigerians, etc., are actually above white people in aggregate and in average. In average and in median. But that may not be true for wealth. Depends on how long home ownership's accrued, etc. Furthermore, home ownership does get diffused in large families. And so generational wealth with multiple families gets diffused in multiple children. So that could play a part in this as well. Why should a Marxist care about it? Because we do have to have an answer to appeals for justice. Now, if most of this is tied into housing, and I believe from what we can tell, most of it is, in regards to 90% of the white versus Black population, then we can very easily say this is a housing policy fix. Now, I say that very easily. Yes, we can say this is a housing policy fix. Getting that housing policy fix done, however, well, we have trouble getting enough housing stock to regulate the market. What do you expect is going to happen? But in a very real sense, at least we know what to do there. And yes, on the uber wealthy, it's a simple matter of expropriating excess wealth. But it's interesting that the average white wealth, which is, again, about 6 times higher, I think I said 7, about 6 times higher than the median white wealth, the average black wealth is about $40,000 less than the median white wealth. But that means there's a greater distance between the median black wealth and the median white wealth than there is between the average black wealth and the average white wealth. It's about 8 times more in median, about 6.7 times more in average, meaning there are very rich black elites taking that up, but there's nowhere near as many of them as there would be white ones. Now, part of that's just the nature of the demographics of the United States. Black families are about 14%. The majority minority future is largely based off of immigration from wealthy countries and large Latin families and Latin American immigration. Meaning that it looks different. The situation looks different for different demographic groups. So we can't assume that some of this isn't just numbers. But I don't want to make excuses for it. This should not exist. There's a history of racialized capital unfairness here, even within the working class. And it actually probably is what incentivizes a lot of what we would consider reactionary responses to things like housing development, racial integration in neighborhoods, etc., until relatively recently. Probably still incentivizes it, frankly. There are just other counter incentives now. What is the Marxist to do? What is the socialist to do? Well, we have to admit and frame our policies in a way that will fix this without making it an issue of retribution for past events, of which perhaps not everyone who has a skin color is directly or even indirectly responsible for. This is not to say that systemic white privilege is not real. It very much is. But it is to say that if we're going to talk about this, we need to talk about this in a fine-tooth and responsible way, and our current ways of gathering these stats do not help this. In short, we don't have a good enough research program on the lineage of wealth within the social classes, meaning where are the people who were able to pass money down or property down, and how is that magnifying over time or diffusing over time? Who are those people specifically, not just in their self-identified race, but in their ancestry, their heritage, their relationship to the United States, how long they've been here, what sectors their families worked in, what classes they belong to, etc. In short, the problem isn't intersectionality versus Marxism. The problem is that we haven't looked at this in a rigorous intersectional, and by that I mean at different categories, looking at them honestly, way. We can't speak about this clearly. I'm going to link the Brookings Institute paper that I saw. And I want to thank Colin Drumm for getting me to clarify my position on this, because it does matter. It changes a lot of economic outcomes, even just looking at the median. But there's also just huge wealth inequity across the board that this exposes. One that is, in real terms, massive, way more massive than the difference between black and white median income, wealth, not income. But we shouldn't use that to not deal with the fact that there really are ways in which black wealth has been hampered legally and by subtler means, some maybe not even intentional. One of the things that I like about talking about systemic racism as opposed to the way that which say Abraham X. Kendi wants to collapse these terms, is that some of these racial things are knock-on effects from explicit racial policy, but they probably weren't deliberately racialized. Now, that's important to understand. And on that note, like and subscribe. I don't have so many policy recommendations on how to fix this, except in the fact that it seems to be tied to housing in some key way. In a socialist society, I think a lot of this would fix itself, which is why I kind of take the Adolf Reed approach. But there is a real sense of injustice here that does need to be dealt with. It needs to be spoken to. All right. And one thing I like to tell people, you don't speak to every group the same way. I don't mean you lie to anybody. In fact, you should tell the truth all the time. But the facts you focus on are different depending on the group's needs. The way we deal with different sectors of workers and the contradictions therein need to be honest, but need to take each section's grievances and realities into account. We can't just aggregate it away because it will feel very false to most people. And on that note, have a great day.